Welcome back, everyone, to 101 Questions That Church Planters Ask. I'm your host, Danny Parmalee, and today we're answering a listener-submitted question. Should I just go ahead and get a therapist now? I have zero context of the question, but it's actually a really good one. And to help us answer that question, I'm super excited about our guest today. His name is Rick Egbert, and the reason it's so awesome to have him on, not only his knowledge in this area, but Rick was a coach and mentor of mine when I was a church planter, and some of the advice and counsel that he gave me as a young church planter really completely changed really some of the outcome stuff of what was going on at Epico. So I tell him this all the time. He probably thinks I just say it to everybody, but I am super indebted. The church was super indebted to him pouring in. So Rick, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Man, it's my pleasure to be here, Danny. And man, I love pastors, and I'm stoked to be here. I think that mental health is such a huge issue, and I'm glad to be able to be here and help out.
Awesome. All right, a little background, because I think this is fascinating about you. I want to hear your 3 major job changes. So in other words, going back to Discover into executive pastor of a mega church, and then now into what you do now. And the reason why that's so important is not just, to brag about your amazing past, but to show why when you're speaking to these issues that you have kind of this ability to kind of understand what people are going through.
Yeah. So briefly, I'm 114 years old, right?
Exactly.
So I've had 3 very different careers. And so I spent the first 21 years of my adulthood in working in the corporate world. I was in IT and worked in many big companies, including Discover Card was the last one. And then I came to faith late in life. I was 38 when I first came to faith, and within a few years, I transitioned from the marketplace into full-time ministry, and took a job at the chapel, which is in the northwest side of Chicago, multi-site church, and worked in that capacity for 15 years. And during that time, especially, God put this call in my heart that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about some of the differences here. God placed on my heart that there were certain people that I just couldn't help as much as I wanted to. And so God really focused my ministry in on the third career, which is licensed counseling, therapeutic counseling. And so went through, it's about a 10-year journey of managing that transition. And I'm now a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois.
That is just great. And I do remember we were still in a coaching relationship at the time. You said, "Hey, I think I'm gonna change careers." And I thought, maybe you were drinking heavily. Maybe you were the one that needed a therapist at that time. So all right, so let's dive into this a little bit. And part of this, it speaks directly to that question. I think of like when a church planter moves to town, they find a new primary care physician. But that doesn't usually happen with counselors. Is there such a thing where you just go, like, you don't need one at the moment, but that it is wise to say, all right, well, this is my new setting, a new place. I'm just going to get one when I don't need one. So I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of wisdom in doing that, and I think for a couple of different reasons, right? The first is for personal reasons, right? So for yourself as a pastor, I mean, I having been a pastor, I was not a lead pastor. I was a executive pastor, so I was kind of second seat for most of that time. But I mean, let's be honest, like stress on pastors, it's always been enormous. I don't think it's ever been as heavy as it is today. The expectations that people put on their pastors and that we as pastors put on ourselves, I think at times it can just be crushing, right? And so there's this sense of everywhere we go, we're expected to be on, right? So we got to be ready to give like stellar catalytic leadership, unending compassion to whoever needs it, right? Ready at a moment's notice, any time of the day and night to go to the hospital or be with whoever, or listen to the person whose wife just said they're going to leave them. Be an inspiring teacher and preacher, right? Be able to give spirit anointed prayer at any time, right? No matter what's going on in our own life, words of encouragement. I mean, it's a staggering amount, like to be the CEO, the theologian, the He
Yeah.
it's across the board. It's just a staggering amount of expectations that we place on ourselves and that others place on us. So I think for us and being able to manage some of those various stresses ourselves, I think is important. But there's also, when you go into a new area, you're absolutely going to have people in your congregation that are going to need help. So I recommend to pastors to begin creating like your resource referral list as
Yeah.
soon as possible. And the best
Good.
way to do that is to actually get on the phone and start talking to them, right? Meet with them, right? Most of them will be more than happy to take you out for a free lunch, right? And we know as pastors, we love a free lunch,
Yep,
right?
of course.
And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of reason for people when they go to a new town for pastors to find somebody real quick.
That's great. I love that. It's and too, like you said, there's kind of a two-hit thing there where you can even say, "Hey, I'm trying to build my referral list," and there might be some great people that you meet that, that way you're able to say, "Hey, yeah, I talked to this, counselor, and give them a shot." Or here's the three that I would at least start to recommend, as you have to kind of point other people in your congregation who
Hmm.
need help with that.
Yep.
So this is kind of a two-part question, besides just maybe doing a phone book or an internet search and building that list. How do you find a good counselor? Maybe what are some of the different questions that you might ask? And then the other thing is if you can speak to a little bit of the difference between licensed, certified, biblical counseling, spiritual direction. And I don't even know what I would call you now. Like, are you a psychologist? Are you a therapist? Are you a counselor, a doctor? I mean, I don't know what.
There's words I would call myself, maybe like guru or sage
Guru.
or
Yeah.
whatever, right? I don't know. I'm being silly, right? No, I'm a counselor. I'm a therapist. So the
Okay.
words let's go through that real quick, like right, and we'll kind of knock that one out in quick order. So therapist and clinician. So therapist, counselor, the states licensing is handled by the states. And
Okay.
so those positions are now licensed in every state in the nation, including Tennessee, where you are, Illinois, where I am, Wisconsin. So all the states, they all dictate that licensing and counseling is now something that must be done by a professional. They have to have a certain level of training, they have to pass certain board exams, and then they have to be licensed by the state.
Okay. And it might be a little bit different from state to state, but essentially I can't just go online and say, you know what? I'm a pastor. I have some good advice. I want to be a counselor. So I can't use that term and set up my own practice.
Yeah. The one thing I would say is one of the things you didn't list in your list was a life coach.
Right.
So here's what I'm going to tell you about life coaches. They can be awesome, and there's no regulation, professional regulation of them
Okay.
whatsoever. So I know people who literally have said, "Dang, I'm pretty wise. Let me go and take this 8-hour course and then bill myself on Facebook as being
Right.
as being
Trained,
a life coach,
trained,
a
yeah,
trained
trained life coach.
certified, right? So
Right.
all certified means is that somebody gave you a piece of paper to say that you're certified. It means
Right.
nothing, right? And I'm not saying it means nothing, but it doesn't give you the
Yeah.
same kind of assurances as a professional license does.
Okay, that's good, and for some reason, I'm thinking of Tommy Boy right now. I believe there's
Oh
a
my
line
god.
in there where he says, "You can certify a lump of crap," or something like that. So that's like a good certification doesn't mean anything. So licensed counselor, that's kind of thing.
Yeah, and so let's talk briefly about, and then I'm going to get to the criteria thing real quick, like right.
Yep.
So the term biblical counseling, and I might step on some toes here, right? So biblical counseling is not what most pastors think about when they think about biblical counseling. So if I'm counseling somebody who is having some marital issues, okay, well I go back to the book of Genesis, right? And I talk about God's design for marriage, and I talk about husbands and wives in Ephesians 5, and I give all that stuff, right? And I can work through a certain amount of stuff. That's counseling using scripture. But
Mhm.
there is a term that started like back in the 60s that's literally called biblical counseling with a capital B and a capital C. And
Okay.
it means something very different. It is a whole school of thought that says that the kind of counseling that is both science and faith based integrated together that I do is wrong.
Okay.
And so there's a whole, school of that. And I respect those folks. I know we're going to be in heaven with them, but I think they're wrong, right? Yeah. So in terms of to answer the first question, which is like, what do you look for, right? How do you find people? So two different things. One is the pools that you fish in. So the most effective pool to fish in is word of mouth, right? So you start, put out on Facebook in an area like, hey, recommendations for a good Christian therapist, right? You want to stick with Christian therapists. However, there are Christian therapists, and then there are therapists who are Christian. So what I mean by that is that there are some people who you would go to them in your practice, and they might be Christians, but you'd be hard pressed to gather enough evidence in their actual work to say it influences the work that they do,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's a difference between that and being a spirit led Christian counselor, right? So word of mouth is a first pool to dig into. Whatever insurance pool you're on, right? That your insurance covered, like go on to the providers. Most of them provide search, like you can put in search arguments for Christian, right? And just start going down those. Start looking at their web pages, right? Do you see, like, does it resonate with your heart? Start picking out some people. So then when you meet with them and they're willing to come, like, hey, can I buy you lunch? Like, trust me
Yes.
when I'm saying, like, therapists are more than happy. Usually they have to be on the side of knocking on your door.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in terms of what are you looking for with them, right? So you're looking for faith, obviously, and faith that aligns with your faith, with your church's doctrine, right? And you can ask all those questions. Like a, a good Christian counselor shouldn't be freaked out by that, and they should be able to give
Right.
you answers to defend
Yeah.
where they're at, right? So second is experience. Like, do you have experience? Like, what experience? It isn't like, are you experienced enough? But what areas do you have experience in? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, because of my life, I have experience of working with pastors and with families that are adoptive families, and foster families. So I have that's mapped upon kind of where I've worked and where God's led me, what paths He's led me on. And then the final one is fit, and this is just one, like, you're sitting with this person over lunch, right? And you're like, would I hand off somebody I care to this person?
Yeah.
Like, would I let my wife, would I have my sister go to this person, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you have any catch in your spirit about that, ixnay. You're just like,
Yeah.
hey, thanks for lunch,
Right.
and then you move on from there.
That's very good. Now, I know we could probably do a whole episode on it. I don't want to, but I just want to kind of repeat back to you because I think you hit something important. So the difference between biblical counseling and being a counselor that is a Christian, biblical counseling, that capital B, capital C, is a different process. It is not using the
That's right.
kind of therapy type of thing. So it is not saying, well, I don't do biblical counseling, does not mean that you don't believe in the Bible and that you're not going to steer
Heavens,
people in a
no,
biblical way.
no,
It just means
no.
that the capital B, capital C is, here is kind of the way that it's done. I don't want to minimize it by saying, but hey, this is your answer is going to be found right here. We don't need to use any of the other healing principles over
Yeah,
time.
and the basic, yeah, it's huge. And the basic principle is just everything that's mentally health, wrong with you, it comes directly from sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that any of the evidence based scientific things that we've learned about brain science and all those kinds of things, none of that matters.
Right.
And so, yeah,
Right. So that's the nice thing about a podcast. We're allowed to have opinions and stuff
that's
like
right.
that on
And
there.
anybody who
And
has
so
questions about that can
yeah.
definitely, like, email Danny Parmalee
Yeah.
at
Yeah, exactly. So okay, so this is really good. So we kind of we'll go back to even that analogy of finding a doctor or when you find a doctor when you first move into town. Is there a type of thing where a pastor can just do a yearly checkup or something like that? Like, hey, I'm just going to put it on the calendar. There's nothing wrong. Or would a counselor go, what are you doing in my office? Like, I have people that I need to see. That would be like someone coming into the emergency room and saying, Hey, yeah, just check my pulse, check my temperature, see if I'm doing okay. Or our counselor's like, no, that's a really good thing. Just do a once a year checkup, and who knows, maybe some things will get discovered during that time, and we, schedule some more stuff.
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I liken it to, you wouldn't go to an emergency room for your annual checkup. You would go to your doctor, your primary care physician, right?
Mhm.
And they're not necessarily they're assessing your overall wellness. And so there's an element there of, you know, uh, the same can be definitely true with a counselor of being able to go through it,
Yeah.
despite the fact that, people think that counselors want everybody to be crazy so that we always have clients, right?
Yeah.
We actually really care about people. And we'd
Mhm.
much rather keep, just like doctors, we'd much rather keep people mentally healthy,
Yeah.
right? If I keep you, like, if you're my client and I'm keeping you mentally healthy, you're going to have far more, like, not only are you going to be healthier, you're going to have far more referrals for me. You're like, hey, the guy that helps me stay healthy is this
Mhm.
guy over here, and
Yeah.
so I think he can help you not only get healthy but stay healthy. So it's just, overall, we want to raise the overall water level. So preventative health is important for our body. It's also important for our soul, our spirit, our mind.
That's great. I love too when pastors are able to even say that from the pulpit, and to be able to even just throw in little things like, "Yes, I was meeting with my counselor. I do my checkup," or just to mention those types of things to almost destigmatize, so to speak, this idea of going. So, all right, what are some of the signs? I know that pastors are very good at just kind of putting their head down and pushing forward, and sometimes they're not even aware because they're not taking time to even
Yeah.
evaluate. But are there some things where, maybe there's some signs? Hey, you know what? It's time to be proactive, and this is more than just a checkup. You need to kind of see someone.
Yeah, I yeah, I think that there are a lot of signs, that we want to look at. I guess I would bucket them a little bit. Is, when you're feeling overstressed, and that can be an easy place, right? But I'm not talking about overstress once. Like, here we are, right before the holidays, and there's a sense of, like, you know, uh, okay, this is a crazy time to be a pastor,
Yep.
and there's a pandemic, and there, all of those things. And so, of course, there's going to be some stress, but we're talking about prolonged stress, right? Where somebody's experiencing significant signs of depression or anxiety. Let me talk very briefly about that. So if you're experiencing either a lot of sadness, kind of most days, right? Worry that's hard to control. A big one is this thing called anhedonia, which is just another really fancy schmancy name, which we, counselors have to have. That's why we get a license, right? So we can have fancy words. Anhedonia basically just means that we kind of numb out. We lose interest in things we used to have interest in, and we don't get pleasure out of things we used to get pleasure out of. We can start having signs of insomnia, difficulty concentrating, appetite change, even thoughts of hurting ourselves. Right? There can be irritability that becomes really, these types of things. All those signs of depression and anxiety. If you have a day or two, like, we all have moments, right? We all have days where we're like, "Wow, it's a bad day. I feel like crap." But it's a different thing when that's going on kind of week after week. Or one of the signs is if we find ourselves caught in compulsive and sinful behavior,
Mm.
right? If we're finding ourselves, involved in porn, involved in other kind of, you know, uh, pastors, we're all human too, right? We could become addicted to prescription drugs just like anybody,
Yeah.
right? To porn, to any of the other number of things that, people can become involved in. And so those are all signs. The last one I'll just mention is isolation.
Hmm.
That's a big thing for pastors,
Hmm.
is this sense of being isolated. Here they are in a sea full of people, but they're alone. Nobody has that perch that they do, and all the expectations that come with it. So those are all signs that I would say, if you're experiencing those and it's going on for more than just a few days at a time, you probably want to consider talking to somebody.
That's great. Okay, here's kind of the final question, and you mentioned it a little bit already, but I'm wondering if you are seeing any just kind of patterns in pastoral kind of mental health, these things that maybe the rest of us, we're not seeing, and maybe there's even a listener that's like, man, I feel like the oddball here, but that you're just seeing overall, yes, pandemic stuff, but I mean, even before that type of thing that you're seeing. So
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I'm seeing is pastor burnout. I have a number of pastors as clients, and I see a lot of burnout. And so you can think of burnout as manifests itself, and I'll go through this real quick. Like manifests itself in four different ways. These might be other signs that are there. The first is alienation from our work related activities, right? And that might look like a ton of stress, a lot of frustration, cynicism, right? When you find yourself saying, instead of saying, "Oh, I've got an appointment with Joe at 4 o'clock," you find yourself saying, "Oh yeah, I've got that 4 o'clock,"
hmm.
right? Kind of dehumanizes it a
Yeah,
little bit, right?
yeah.
When we find ourselves distancing ourselves and numbing out, right? All of that being alienation from kind of work related activities. Second is when we have physical symptoms of burnout, like headaches and stomach problems, digestive issues. Seems like there's so many pastors I know who have IBS, who have developed IBS, right? It's like, it almost feels like a pandemic of itself
Wow.
for pastors. Emotional exhaustion is a big sign of burnout. That's the one we normally associate, with burnout. Is we're just drained all the time. We have an inability to cope with things. Our resilience goes down. Where we're doing really well, we can like leap over a building in a single bound, right? But when we're burned out, it's like we trip over gravel, right? It's a really, really different thing. And extreme fatigue. And then the fourth thing that's a sign of burnout is reduced performance. And so we start to see in our job that's like things start to things start to fall away. More and more things fall through the crack as we get cynical and burned out. And so and and just to kind of round this out, there are a number of risk factors. I'm gonna roll through these real quick, like
Mhm.
that make somebody more susceptible to burnout. And so unreasonable time pressures. I know we don't have any of these as pastors. Luckily, we don't, right,
Yeah.
suffer from any of that, right? A lack of communication and support from above. So if you have a board, or the denominational support isn't, which of course is not the case for your church planters, Danny, right? Because they have you, and I know you, and I'm teasing you, but I know you, and I know that. But even with fellow workers, or if there are board of elders or deacons or whatever, that stuff, lack of role clarity. Little is as burnout producing as role ambiguity. If we are unclear about what our role is, it can be really, really bad. um, Unmanageable workload. Again, as pastors, it seems like that's the world we kind of live in. Relationships in our life that are below average or poor.
Mhm.
Marriage, kids, coworkers, etc. Poor spiritual well-being, like lack of well-being on the spiritual side. Like we can only give away what we have, right? And
Right.
if we're dry and empty, that we're trying to give out of that. And then finally, just the day-to-day tasks. When our day-to-day tasks don't fit our calling or our gifting, it's a huge risk for burnout.
Yeah.
So I don't know
Yeah.
if that helps a bit.
Perfect. No, that's really great. And Rick, I just want to say thank you again, not just for being on the podcast, but honestly for what you do. I know that you are just a huge resource to pastors and to lots of people that way. And I want to thank you, listeners, of course, for listening. And if you have any questions, you can submit them at churchplantersask.com. And until next time, keep asking those questions.